Hello everyone, hope you're all well and you've been enjoying the story of Paddington so far. Today I'm going to carry on reading the story to you. I am going to carry on from chapter 3. It's called Paddington Goes Underground. Paddington was very surprised when he woke up the next morning and found himself in bed. He decided it was a nice feeling as he stretched himself and pulled the sheets up round his head with a paw. He reached out with his feet and found a cool spot for his toes. One advantage of being a very small bear in a large bed was that there was so much room. After a few minutes, he poked his head out cautiously and sniffed. There was a lovely smell of something coming under the door. It seemed to be getting nearer and nearer. There were footsteps too coming up the stairs. As they stopped by his door, there was a knock and Mrs. Bird's voice called out, "Are you awake, young Paddington?" "Only just," called out Paddington, rubbing his eyes. The door opened. "You've had a good sleep," said Mrs. Bird as she placed a tray on the bed and drew the curtains. "And you're a very privileged person to have breakfast in bed on a weekday." Paddington eyed the tray hungrily. There was half a grapefruit in a bowl, a plate of bacon and eggs, some toast and a whole pot of marmalade, not to mention a large cup of tea. "Is all that for me?" he exclaimed. "Well, if you don't want it, I can soon take it away again," said Mrs. Bird. "Oh, I do," said Paddington hurriedly. "It's just that I've never seen so much breakfast before." "Well, you'd better hurry up with it." Mrs. Bird turned in the doorway and looked back. "Because you're going on a shopping expedition this morning with Mrs. Brown and Judy. All I can say is, thank goodness I'm not going too." She closed the door. "Now, I wonder what she means by that," said Paddington. But he didn't worry about it for very long. There was far too much to do. It was the first time he had ever had breakfast in bed, and he soon found it wasn't quite so easy as it looked. First of all, he had trouble with the grapefruit. Every time he pressed it with his spoon, a long stream of juice shot up and hit him in the eye, which was very painful. And all the time he was worried because the bacon and eggs were getting cold. Then there was the question of the marmalade. He wanted to leave room for the marmalade. In the end, he decided it would be much nicer if he mixed everything up on the one plate and sat on the tray to eat it. "Oh, Paddington," said Judy when she entered the room a few minutes later and found him perched on the tray. "Whatever are you doing now? Do hurry up. We're waiting for you downstairs." Paddington looked up, an expression of bliss on his face. That part of his face which could be seen behind egg whiskers and toast crumbs. He tried to say something, but all he could manage was a muffled grunting noise which sounded like "I'm just coming," all rolled into one. "Really?" Judy took out her handkerchief and wiped his face. "You are the stickiest bear imaginable. And if you don't hurry up, all the nice things will be gone. Mummy's going to buy you a complete new outfit from Barkridge's. I heard her say so. Now comb your fur quickly and come on down." As she closed the door, Paddington looked at the remains of his breakfast. Most of it was gone, but there was a large piece of bacon left, which it seemed a pity to waste. He decided to put it into his suitcase in case he got hungry later on. He hurried into the bathroom and rubbed his face over with some warm water. Then he combed his whiskers carefully, and a few moments later, not looking perhaps as clean as he had done the evening before, but quite smart, he arrived downstairs. "I hope you're not wearing that," said Mrs. Brown as she looked down at him. "Oh, do let him, Mummy," cried Judy. "It's so unusual." "It's unusual, all right," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like it before. It's such a funny shape. I don't know what you'd call it." "It's a bush hat," said Paddington proudly, and it saved my life." "Saved your life?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "Don't be silly. How could a hat save your life?" Paddington was about to tell her of his adventure in the bath the evening before when he received a nudge from Judy. She shook her head. It's a long story," he said lamely. "Then you'd better save it for another time," said Mrs. Brown. "Now come along, both of you." Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Mrs. Brown and Judy to the front door. By the door, Mrs. Brown paused and sniffed. "That's very strange," she said. "There seems to be a smell of bacon everywhere this morning. Can you smell it, Paddington?" Paddington started. He put the suitcase guiltily behind himself and sniffed. He had several expressions which he kept for emergencies. There was his thoughtful expression, when he stared into space and rested his chin on a paw. Then there was his innocent one, which wasn't really an expression at all. He decided to use this one. "It's very strong," he said truthfully, for he was a truthful bear. And then he added, perhaps not quite so truthfully, "I wonder where it's coming from." "If I were you," whispered Judy as they walked along the road towards the tube station, "I should be more careful in future when you pack your suitcase." Paddington looked down. A large piece of bacon stuck out of the side of his suitcase and was trailing on the pavement. "Shoo!" cried Mrs. Brown as a grubby-looking dog came bounding across the road. Paddington waved his suitcase. "Go away, dog," he said sternly. The dog licked its lips and Paddington glanced anxiously over his shoulder as he hurried on, keeping close behind Mrs. Brown and Judy. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I have a funny feeling about today, as if things are going to happen. Do you ever have that feeling, Paddington?" Paddington considered for a moment. "Sometimes," he said vaguely as they entered the station. At first, Paddington was a little bit disappointed in the underground. He liked the noise and the bustle and the smell of warm air which greeted him as they went inside, but he didn't think much of the ticket. He examined carefully the piece of green cardboard which he held in his paw. "It doesn't seem much to get for 80p, he said. After all the lovely whirring and clanking noises the ticket machine had made, it did seem disappointing. He'd expected much more for his money. "But Paddington," Mrs. Brown sighed, "you only have a ticket so that you can ride on the train. They won't let you on otherwise." She looked and sounded rather flustered. Secretly, she was beginning to wish they had waited until later in the day, when it wasn't quite so crowded. There was also the peculiar business of the dogs. Not one, but 6 dogs of various shapes and sizes had followed them right inside. She had a funny feeling it had something to do with Paddington. But the only time she caught his eye, it had such an innocent expression she felt quite upset with herself for having such thoughts. "I suppose," she said to Paddington as they stepped on the escalator, "we ought really to carry you. It says you're supposed to carry dogs, but it doesn't say anything about bears." Paddington didn't answer. He was following behind in a dream. Being a very short bear, he couldn't easily see over the side. But when he did, his eyes nearly popped out with excitement. There were people everywhere. He'd never seen so many. There were people rushing down one side, and there were more people rushing up the other. Okay, I'm going to leave Paddington there for today, and there's going to be another teacher reading the second half of chapter 3 tomorrow. I wonder which teacher it will be, and I wonder what Paddington's going to get up to next. I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. Goodbye, everyone.